Welcome back to this channel. It's your resident internet psychic medium and spiritual advisor, Mr. Crane, and today I want to talk to you about an epiphany I just had. So before going into my epiphany, you can see the filming location has changed. We are now in my kitchen, and so I had an idea. Tell me if it's corny. I think I want to start calling these impromptu recordings kitchen diaries. Let me know if you think it's corny though, right? Because if it's corny, I'm keeping it. Because I love corny things like that. Or if you have something better, let me know that too. But yeah, so my epiphany. I have been doing a lot of healing. And in the midst of the healing journey that I discussed a little bit ago, that was triggered by falling in love and getting engaged. Part of that experience was shock. And the shock was, wait a minute, I thought you dealt with a lot of this stuff already. Like, why are you still crying, right? Like, what's the problem? And that started to get me thinking, like, I think we all have these moments of feeling like we're doing an enormous amount of healing, feeling like we have gotten over something. You know, maybe we got over that ex, or maybe we felt like we came through on the other side after losing a job. Maybe you experienced a death, right? We all reach this phase or like this stage where we're like, okay, I'm good now, right? And then something happens later. And a lot of the times it seems like it happens like years later or like a long period of time later that triggers you. And then you go back into that same emotional place that you thought that you had healed from. And then somebody said something. And what they said was, yeah, okay, you dealt with your inner child, but did you deal with your inner teenager? And I was like, holy crap, there are more stages to this. And that was the first time I like had the realization of like, oh, we're not done. Like I always knew that healing was a lifelong journey. I have always believed that there is no such thing as being fully healed, because if you were, why would we be here? Like, why would we be incarnate on earth? There wouldn't be anything for us to do. There wouldn't be any lessons for us to learn. So I always had the belief that you always continued, but for some reason it hadn't occurred to me that that little child that we go to nurture, that we learn to go back and give a hug and go back and apologize to, grew up. And when did you start your healing journey? The majority of us started it when we got to adulthood, or at least when we made it somewhere like some ways through adulthood. That means the inner child grew up to a teenager. It went through an adolescent period. And then that inner teenager then grew up into an inner adult. So not only do we have to deal with an inner child, once we complete that step, we have to continue to move up to the inner adolescent or the inner teenager and then to the inner adult. And then so that got me thinking and understanding my emotional reactions to things. Previously, like in the very beginning of my journey, my emotional reactions was tears. I used to cry a lot. Very sensitive, very sensitive, very soft, and not in a bad way, but like in a way that like a child would be. And when things would happen to me, when I would felt triggered, I was always, it would send me back into like that feeling I had as a kid, like in grade school, where I would have to like sit in timeout. It was that kind of feeling. So some like shame was kind of woven in there somehow. And then when I came out of that, my phase, I remember going through and periodically still deal with being angry. Now when I'm triggered, I'm angry. I'm not sad. I don't really consider myself to be sensitive. I think I'm incredibly empathic and I have a lot of empathy, but I don't consider myself to be like a sensitive kind of person. I'm really only sensitive, and actually it's probably not sensitivity, it's probably more so vulnerability around people that are incredibly close to me. But I get angry, and it's self-righteous. Like, how dare you, right? And I always interpreted that as like, yeah, I healed my inner child and this is me being a boss bitch. What I recognize now is that no, that's actually your inner teenager responding. That is all of the angst you used to have as a teenager, because a lot of us have it, right? Hormonal, right? All of the anger, all the times where you felt misunderstood, because when there's a period in your life where you feel misunderstood, it's when you're a teenager. And my triggers happen that make me angry happen to be the same things that happened to me when I was a teenager, typically with my mother. When things would happen, I would get in trouble maybe, and I would feel like, you don't understand me. Like, we all know that, right? Like, when you were like a teen, nobody understood what you were going through. And but it's those moments when I was a teenager where I felt like nobody understood me or what I was going through. Whenever I get triggered and it's mirroring a emotion or a moment or a situation that is close to that time, I get angry and I get angsty and I get irritable and I get frustrated and self-righteous. And it has turned into, well, everyone doesn't understand me, to, I don't care if you understand me, be stupid, I don't care. And like, okay, that may sound real egotistical, right? But that's like part of the journey. The journey is understanding your ego, understanding your shadow self. And that's part of my shadow self. I just had interpreted that as just being my way of handling things, or being someone that doesn't take crap about nothing from nobody. And I'm now realizing that, like, no, what's actually happening is that it's your inner teenager that's actually responding to that situation. And that it has nothing to do with being someone that doesn't take crap from anybody. And not like you need to work on that. And so now my phase of my journey, as opposed to before where it was working on like my sensitivities and what made my heart hurt and what caused grief and sadness, to now understanding what causes my anger. And right now I have a very sort of cursory view of it, because it's now just like walking into my awareness. But it's definitely something that I'm going to be spending years on, right? In terms of this phase of really getting an idea and an understanding of like why. I always tell you guys, go back and find little you. I always say there is a defining marker in everyone's childhood that usually occurs around the age of 7 or 8, where something traumatic happened for you and it switched for you. And a lot of us can pinpoint that moment, right? And if you can't pinpoint it right away, maybe you think about it for a day or two and then you go, oh, yeah. We all kind of have that one sort of traumatic experience, right? Around that age of life. Now I have to find, where was that moment when I was a teenager? Was I 13? Was I 14? Was it my mom? Was it a boy at school that I had a crush on? Like, I now have to go through that journey to figure out that defining moment when I was a teenager. I found that little girl. I found the inner child. I found her. We hugged it out. I kissed her on the forehead. I told her I love her, that I'm going to do better going forward. And I don't have as many inner child triggers as I used to have. I still have them because I'm normal. I will have them for my entire life, just like you will have them for your entire life. But the difference between then and now is that I have an awareness of when it comes out versus before when I didn't. What I now need to do is grow an awareness of when my inner teenager pops out, so I can figure out where the teenage version of me is hiding, so I can go find her and give her a hug. And that's going to be my next phase of my journey. And then what I then realized, after knowing that there's an inner teenager, right? There is an inner adult, because we typically do not start the healing process until we are adults, until we get sick and tired, right? And we can't do it anymore, right? Until the depression got so bad, or that breakup was so awful, right? For some of you are lucky. Some of you like stumbled across a crystal and like the rose quartz was speaking to you and you're like, oh my God, I'm gonna change my life. But for a lot of us, right, it was a mess, right? And so I also have to go to, where is the inner adult? Now, I actually, ironically enough, have a better guess of where my inner adult was left. I think my inner adult is actually 20 years old, and I have an idea of where she was left. But I need to get through this teenager thing first in order to properly be able to assess that. So, anyway, I say all of that to say, or really to bring awareness to you all and to bring a question to you all. Have you considered that perhaps you feel like this on your inner journey, in the sense of, I thought I was making progress, but then I'm going back downhill, and I thought I met my inner child, but then I'm going back downhill? Is there a situation where maybe you did actually meet your inner child, but then forgot about or didn't consider that maybe there was an inner teenager in there too? And that maybe you may also have to go back and figure out and find out where that inner teenager is? Because I don't think that for a lot of people, the inner teenager starts at 13. I think that it can be at any point in your adolescence. For some people, that inner teenager may start at 11, right? Let's say maybe you grew up in a single parent household, or maybe you were the oldest sibling or something like that, and you had to pick up more responsibilities in the house at a younger age than some of your peers. Maybe your adolescence started earlier, right? Or maybe you just went through a really traumatic event that made you grow up faster than what you would have cared to grow up for. So it may not start at 13, right? Maybe you are someone that felt like you actually had a smooth sailing childhood up until maybe 16, right? Maybe yours is later. So I think that when we are examining where our inner teenager is, we have to kind of widen our scope in terms of where we're looking and what happened. I think we also have to, as adults, right, start exercising judgment on what actually happened. Because when you are younger, your perception of events is different than when it is when you get older. Especially when you're a teenager, your perception of what happens a lot of times is bigger than what it probably really was, right? That first crush you had, maybe the first breakup you had, felt at that time to be incredibly monumental, but now you may look back on it and you realize, oh, that really wasn't that big of a deal, right? So I think when going through this journey of figuring out what the inner teenager is, we're going to have to do a lot more digging and exercising better judgment of figuring out, okay, is this the actual starting point of this phase? Or was this just a hard time? And I think we may have to do that more than what we would do as a child. Because as a child, with your inner child, there's so much purity and there's so much innocence there that the marker, I believe, is probably a lot more clear cut, a lot more defined. But I think when you're dealing with a teenager, I don't think necessarily that that would be the case. I think you may have to dig with a wider scope, trying to find that defining moment and trying to unpack what it is that it did for you. And then when you move into your inner adult, and then trying to figure out where that marker is and what to do about that, I think your inner adult is more so about your coping mechanisms than it is so about the defining trauma marker. I think the crazy thing about life is that so much of our trauma we get in our adolescence, in our childhood and our adolescence. That is what actually prepares you for adulthood. And if you have trauma in adulthood, maybe it's early in adulthood, or maybe you make it through your 20s and then something really defining happens in your 30s or something like that. But I think that life sets you up to survive, that by the time you hit adulthood, you're probably a lot more resilient. And so I think an inner adult is probably more so about your coping mechanisms, and how your inner adult responds to triggers is through how it's coping, right? Whereas an inner child and an inner teenager is not necessarily responding to a trigger. They're more so reacting to a trigger. That's why when you haven't yet figured out what happened with your inner child, you have a tendency to get yourself into more mess because you're reacting to certain situations, and those reactions may not be helpful for you, right? But I do think as an adult, I think it's more so about coping and how you're coping with certain triggers. And I think that probably a good place to start for people is anyone that maybe is familiar with attachment styles. So anxious attachment, avoidant attachment, that may actually be a good place to start also consider, what are your love languages? Are you a words of affirmation person? Are you a physical touch person? All of those type of things is like a way of coping. It's also a way of self-soothing, right? And that is people's responses to trigger, or that's what people need to feel safe. So for example, if you're thinking about a love language, right? How you receive love, how you give love, that is how you feel safe in a relationship, right? It's a form of self-soothing. It's a form of coping. Maybe start examining why that is your particular language, right? If you're an avoidant or an anxious, why is that your attachment style? Where did that come from? I think a little bit of that will be from your inner child, but I think the other part of that is probably your inner teenager. Food for thought. Let me know what you come up with, and if I've literally just changed some of your lives. If you like what you see, please subscribe to this channel, and I'll see you all soon.